so let me start by explaining what this crisis has done thus far. And I won't delve into the negative aspect that it has done. So much has been written about it. Maybe I will mention 2 or 3 elements it brought forth. The first part is that this virus, as Arundhati Roy said in a recent article in the Financial Times, which I recommend for you, this virus came like an MRI, like an X-ray. And it amplified all the structural weaknesses in our societies, all the existing contradictions and vulnerabilities. The racism, the classism, the exclusion, the violence of exclusion, all the contradictions that of our societies that tend to cater for the majority and for the endowed. And also it is a crisis that, how shall I put it, upended the lives of so many people so suddenly and so simultaneously. We used to think that these problems occur elsewhere. And if we secure the us to keep us safe from the them, we will be happy and secure. It upended that notion of security, which I will come to it. And it made a mockery of all these walls, all these immigration controls, the biometric, the digital surveillance, all the things that will keep us safe from the them. So, it's basically also generated a loss of innocence or complacency. For some of us who have been addicted to the normal, all of a sudden realize that addiction has a cost, and that we need to rethink, and that we're in face of this realization that we are all vulnerable, and none of us is safe. So that is by way of introduction. It basically created a mutual vulnerability, and no one can be safe. You may feel secure, but you're not necessarily safe, as you have seen from the various responses. And now I would like to move to the next point, which is this crisis and the way it has affected us has created a greater awareness of our existing system, of our limitations. And awareness is usually the precursor of change. And the areas where we could influence best change or control our changes in our own behavior. And so I want to mention 4 or 5 areas where change is necessary and possible, and people are aware of it. Let me start with education. Education used to be a series of experiences of collecting knowledge, at the end of which you'll have a certificate that you have mastered the knowledge that is often crafted elsewhere by other people that are far more powerful than you. And then all of a sudden you become a graduate, and then you are supposed to have that license to start living, working, interacting, and so on and so forth. And then you've realized, and in this complex world, it is not enough, because you've realized that in this connected, interconnected world, through technology and through on, you can't really just be you pursuing the linear trajectory. You have knowledge, you have a license to apply it, you have a job, and then you're going to live happily ever after. It just hasn't worked that way, particularly in our interconnected world. And so how can we, people are started thinking, how can we move from knowledge to education, to life education? And there is a discovery that there are people that are more safe and more peaceful because when they connect the dots, educational systems that enlarges the us to make the room for the them are education system that enable society to be peaceful. An educational system that enable people to conjugate everything in the plural. So there is not just the I and the they, but the we. Because crises, climate change, extreme weather events made us all we. It just, and therefore there is now an increasing awareness that education should reflect more and more the we, rather than the them and the us. And so in Africa, for example, there is an increasing emphasis on education for leadership. And that means students are not asked to declare their major. That's not the starting point anymore. The starting point is, what is your mission in life? What are the changes you would like to bring about? And therefore, we're going to start with you. You're the center. And I will expand on that later on. So there is a rethinking taking place. This opportunity, this crisis has made us aware that education is beyond just accumulation of knowledge that you sanctions with a certificate, but education is creating and preparing the future generation of leaders that will not repeat the mistakes of those who are currently in power. In fact, busy more with power rather than governance. Power for the few instead of governance for everyone. There is also an awareness that this crisis may have made us aware of the terrible wounds we may have inflicted on the planet, that the humans have inflicted on the planets. And the planets basically has taken a leave from us, angry. Elle est en congé, has taken a leave. So there is an awareness that unless we revisit the relationship with nature, nature may not come. It may continue to be on leave. And we are aware that the more we alter the climate, the more the planet will respond in ways that are likely to endanger the human life as we know it. And that pandemics and hurricanes and floods and fires and the locust that is destroying East Africa, for example, is no longer just an exception. You know, the melting of the Greenland ice, the West Antarctica ice are not just fluke phenomena. And so people are realizing that we are now seeing the results of deforestation, this haphazard urbanization, this ongoing warming of the planet. So we need to make peace with Mother Nature. So people are realizing that business as usual is not. Otherwise, you will upend the civilization as we have known it. And so there is therefore a growing movement. This coronavirus made us aware that climate change is not there for those who can afford to reject it or those who have to embrace it. We have all to embrace the changes for climate change. Every single one of us has to be an entrepreneur for change with respect to climate. So that's one element. The second aspect that I mentioned briefly is what does security mean anymore? What does it mean to be secure? If you look at the Latin origin of secure, it's C-S-E, cure, C-U-R-E, means free from care, free from worry. That's what security comes from. And people believe that if we put walls, if we put masks, if we have a secure home with all kinds of bad gadgets that tells us who's coming, knocking on the door and take a picture, we will be safe. And we are living in a world that is more and more secure, and we're feeling less and less safe. So people are revisiting the notion of security, of national security, towards a greater identification of, or a positive identification of the conditions required for us all as a member of common society to be able to live together. Security is not protecting me from the other. It's creating the conducive conditions for all of us to be secure, because the threats do not distinguish color or faces. All human beings feel equally vulnerable. So there is a movement, there is a trend to revisit what we mean by security. And there is now a return to this notion of a human security, which has been, up in the 70s by focusing on citizens' experience of insecurity, and by focusing on citizens' welfare and well-being, rather than just expecting that security begins and ends with fending off external threats. And people have realizing that fear is not a good foundation for security. Fearing the others doesn't make me more secure or more safe. It can no longer be the case. He's not going to be out there. So there is an increasing awareness that security comes with inclusion, that the violence that exclusion has created make all of us unsafe. And this is, the coronavirus is not something you can deploy the most sophisticated war arsenals that you've assembled at the expense of taxpayers who no longer find good hospital to go to. In fact, people avoid hospitals because they are afraid of dying faster than being helped. So people have realized that material security, physical security, state security, all the arsenals that we have assembled is not something you're going to use to go to war against something that is invisible. So that's another awareness that came up, and people are really thinking, what do we mean by security? What do we mean by national security? So the first one was nature. We need to revisit our relationship with nature. Second is what makes us secure. And I think and I mentioned a little bit about education. So what do we mean? So where do we go from here? And this is, we will perhaps touch on the Western part. But before that, I think there is a notion of solidarity. Solidarity is up. I don't know if you, in New York at 7 p.m., everyone goes to the balcony. I'm sure you have it all over Europe. And is expressing their solidarity for the real soldiers in the front, which are the nurses, the doctors. So that type of solidarity is increased. Used to say that technology made us live as if we were alone together. It's upended it. We are together alone. So there is, the we is possible again. And because the we is possible again, the idea of co-creating the change is possible. That it is not the problem elsewhere. And this idea of a society that looks for problems and solutions is a bygone. Because there is so much goodness and so much positivity, we need to seize the positivity that this crisis has brought about. And one of them is the togetherness and the solidarity, because people realize fearing the other person is not the solution. Fear is a very bad foundation for being secure. So the we is possible again. So how do we go from here to seize these opportunities, and what kind of leadership and institutions we need to think about in order to convert this awareness into reality? And clearly, education is one of them. And the way you've explained this new experience of education means you are shouldering up your responsibility as an individual, a human being, to do something about it, but in a way that is self-sustainable and sustainable. So education. And what educators are doing, like Alexander, like Dr. Rama, this education that's happening in Africa. There is now a university called African Leadership University. And they teach leadership, not just the science. They teach science, but from a leadership perspective. They teach science, but from peaceful perspective. How can you be a scientist and an engineer, an architect, and be a peace builder? Because peace is about relations. That's what this crisis brought about. Peace, if relations are broken, I can't trust you anymore. And if there is no trust, there is no peace. There is nothing that can be possibly sustainable. So how can we reform the education to take advantage of this new awareness, so we will be a better partner for the planet, a better scientist? Give you another example. I'm engaged with a group of private sector people and educators in Kuwait. And we're trying to create a university of peace, not the university for peace that is in Costa Rica. This is University of Peace. It's just a regular university that accepts engineers, architects, business majors, anyone who wants the traditional faculties or universities or schools, but teach them engineering from a peace perspective. Teach them architecture from a peace perspective. Teaching natural sciences from a peace perspective. So when I'm an architect and I'm asked to help redesign a blighted community, by war, I want to make sure that I rebuild that community to make sure that the church, the synagogue, the mosque are not in the shadow of each other, that they all are shining, that the roads that take us to them is the common same road. We don't take different roads to go to our respective places of worship. So I'm still architecture, but I'm going to do it in such a way that it capitalizes on the we, that there is unity in diversity, e pluribus unum, as the Latin world goes, which unfortunately some nations in North America is just a symbol and not lived up to. Another thing is we need to engage in a conversation, a national conversation. What is security? What makes us secure? Have a conversation. In every community, what is security for you? Students can start it, teachers can do it. It doesn't have to be always coming. If we have enlightened leaders in the top, that's wonderful, they can initiate it. But unfortunately, there is a horrible global deficit of leadership. In Africa, the worst misery comes from the type of leaders we never selected. And so citizen movement to engage into a conversation of what makes us safe and what makes us secure. And maybe we could revisit the concept of human security, because the threats out there are not threats against the state, it's a threats against the human being. And humanity is under stress. So that's another. The other way is multilateralism. Human beings have felt that given the increasing, and particularly coronavirus brought it to the fore, given that these threats spares no one, and the solutions cannot be imagined or envisaged by a particular group of people, however well endowed they may be. It has to be a common endeavor. And therefore, how can we refurbish the existing mechanism for cooperative solution making and for cooperative responses to these common threats to humanity? And how can we revisit these global governance system called the United Nations, called the WHO, instead of criticizing them and blaming them for our weaknesses and say, oh, they are useless. Well, let's revisit them, because we have to work differently to invent solutions to deal with common problem. So one way of capitalizing on this enormous awareness that we are all in this together, let us revisit we the peoples. As you know, the Charter of the United Nations start with these three words: we the peoples determine not to, etc., etc. So how can we the peoples be put into these institutions so they are not we the states? We have found that the state is not the best ally. In fact, the state is the worst creation human beings can ever create, the most violent institution human being can ever create without checks and balances. And if you're not careful, they're going to use the coronavirus to control us even more and to give us false choices between our safety and freedom, security and freedom. They give us all kinds of wrong choices, particularly those who have captured the states for the benefit of the few instead of for the service of the many. So therefore, multilateral institutions cannot be only state-centric as they are now. And I should know a little bit about it since I come from the UN. So how can we bring we the peoples back into multilateralism? So they are not just consulted once the decision is made. They are part of co-creating co-analyzing the problems and co-creating the solutions. So that's one way of going west, to say we already have institutions. They're not perfect. Their relevance is under stress. How can we reform it in such a way that it really addresses a human security, that it really includes the citizen? Because these threats, these pandemics, require both state and citizen leadership at all levels. I think I've gone already beyond the 15 minutes. Maybe I should stop here.
No, it's no problem. Thank you very much for your reflections, and they are indeed very relevant. As you've shared your thoughts on rethinking and rebuilding institutions and maybe enterprises, and shifting from this individualistic perspective to this collective perspective, in my mind, there is this opportunity that is made global and instantaneously relevant to all human beings on Earth. That's maybe a one in a lifetime opportunity. How do we ensure that we are not going back to business as usual? And how do we make sure that the leadership can indeed become leadership in this crisis to really redesign institutions instead of just going back to normality or some form of normality?
Good question. I think people are likely, the longer this pandemic increases, becomes, the more the fractures and the diseases, societal diseases that it has revealed will become intolerable, and people will rise up. You're going to see a lot of social movements. They are for the time being quiet, but there's a lot of suffering, a lot of inequality, and people are going to rise up against that. So that's an instantaneous citizen movements. That are episodic for the time being. Was episodic, the Wall Street movement, you remember? There's going to be a lot of 2.0 movements. So that's one. So unless leaders start catalyzing and saying this is a crisis that should not go to waste, and change the way of governing, people are going to be leading. And you've seen it already. Seen it in Algeria, in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Chile. And they're going to be more and more in the northern, western developed world. Because the inequalities on which that system, individualistic system, capitalist system, has done is that you can no longer hide it under the ideology that market economy is the future, that globalization that is unfair and unequal is the future. So people are going to question, particularly young people. So second element is that leadership should be taught in every single course, even if it's biology and leadership. As a biologist, what are you going to do? What is the impact you want to make? Equally, entrepreneurship should be taught everywhere. Entrepreneurship has to be, because you could no longer rely on the state. State is no longer your ally, unfortunately, because of the behavior of those who have captured it, whether they are well elected or ill elected. So there's going to be either a change that is already programmed now, because our addiction to the normality is not going to help us anymore. It's not going to be sufficient. The world is not going to be, there are some people, of course, who are afraid of losing grip and power. And they can't wait to go back to normal. They are a loser. It's an illusion. But they are powerful. And they are dangerous. Because the world is not going to go into the direction that they used to control and influence. So there has to be organized movement at all levels of society, and particularly citizen-led movements. The private sector, sustainability. You talk about, you listen to the private sector, the buzzword, sustainable. Because they've realized profit is no longer sustainable and everything else is being destroyed. So the private sector, the educators, the academics, the entrepreneurs, women particularly, both old and young. Why? Because women all of a sudden have realized home can be a hell. Either because they have inflicted violence on them, or because they have to do even more work. So we need to incubate a new kind of leadership in every single endeavor. And I think there is no more opportune time for pushing for integral education, where you cannot, because the world we live believes only in things you can quantify, that you could put a number to it. If you want to be successful in business, show me the numbers. And we, unfortunately, neglected the qualitative stuff of our lives. In fact, it's the intangible that makes a difference in our life, whether it is peace, love, affection. These are things you cannot have. You can crave them, but you cannot have. These are things that have to be given. These are things that you have to earn. It takes a long time to get trust, to deserve love and affection and friendship, but it takes very little to lose it. So it's all these intangible things that makes meaning for our lives. Saying thank you when it is deserved. A gesture of solidarity. So what this coronavirus has done is that we need to integrate the subjective and the objective, the quantifiable and the qualitatively different, important. That peace is not when I'm in trouble. That peace is the beginning. So that is, I think, what is needed now is, and it's a good time for this integrative type of education. And it's important that humans are the center, the beginning and the end. They are not an end. That's why integrative development is very important, is because the human is both the vector, the instrument, and the beneficiary of development. The starting point and the end point. I'll stop here. Sorry for the long answer to a simple question.
No, that was by no means a simple question, I think. So your very detailed answer is very welcome. And just to dig a little bit deeper on that, I see a distinction between what you call the we and the true impact and what we can really offer through education or enterprise, and maybe the status quo that we have identified as very resourceful, but maybe not very impactful. So maybe what we could identify as a problem is that integral learning is still an alternative right now. So how do we make an alternative becoming somehow mainstream or being accepted enough so that it can be recognized and valued, and we can go through such an education and be considered, maybe considered, respected, and we can actually deploy our thinking, our knowledge, our resources in this integral way instead of just being in alternative.
Wonderful. There are three key words that you've mentioned. One of them is impact. It's ill understood word. We think impact is the result of our action. That's not impact, that's outcome. That's results that you can connect to your question. Impact is what people do with what you do. In other words, impact is what they do and then you walk backwards. So if we want people to embrace integral education and an integral way of thinking, if that is the ultimate aim, we need to walk backward. And what do we need to do differently? So one thing we need to do differently is we have to challenge our mental frameworks. We need to reframe things. So what this coronavirus has done is that it is challenging our understanding of nature, of security, of education. So the first thing we need to do is reframing. Reframing doesn't mean, just like in my work, I am refraining peace without going through conflict. I am at peace because I don't suffer from violence. It's just like saying I am healthy because I'm free of diseases. So I want to reframe health as a well-being. It has to do with your mental framework, has to be a physical framework, has to do with relationship with nature, has to do with your spiritual, and so on and so forth. So that's the first thing we need to do. We have more and more educated people and less job to fit them. Why? Because we made them think that if you're educated, it is the sure ladder for job future. So we need to tease them. We need to create discomfort that the normal has not gotten us any better. Actually, it's the opposite. As you've heard me say earlier, raise awareness that this way of doing things is not going to get us elsewhere. So you can open up their mental framework. Second, we need to change people's way of looking at things. I'm Western educated, and I was educated to look for problems. What is your thesis? What is the problem? What are the gaps? What is it that you are trying to solve? That's not how the world functions. But because of the powerful Western society and the colonization and the post-Western education, all of that, that's how we were. We have to look for a problem. Even if there is no problems, we have solutions looking for problems. So we only look for what is wrong. So the outsider can come and describe your problems and prescribe solutions. And what has happened is that, gee whiz, there's so many solutions already. Let's make a mapping of what's working. And let's open up to the diversity of addressing challenges. It's not one way. It's not because we have a state then the world is safer. There are so many forms of governance. In Ghana, for example, they have different forms of governance. They have a state, but they have kings that worry about the welfare, the spiritual welfare, the daily welfare, that helps them be free from fear, free from indignities. So let us open people's mind to say there are alternative ways of thinking, and peace actually should be the norm, not the exception. That well-being and health should be the starting point, not the end point that I will get to when I solve my headaches and my problems. So that is, in other words, norm. We have to revisit what is normal. Because what the coronavirus has done is that it made us challenge what we think is normal. We have the wherewithal to deal with the problems. I have my lawyer, my dad, I have a therapist, and I have money. Deal. And the consumerism, you know, you open an ad and you say, aren't you glad you're using Palmolive soap? First of all, who told you I'm glad? Why do I need to? So there is a lot of things that you need to revisit. And one of them is to say, we need to start building change on what's already working. We need to build change on what people recognize as knowledge that you already have and solution that you already have. Why? Because the more you build on endogenous capacity, the more what your support will be self-sustainable. And that's basically part of my work on sustaining peace, as you may have seen from some of my work. There are books that have come up, and we should capitalize. And maybe there should be maybe something that the Home for Humanity could start is have a global agora. An agora means a forum. Asia Forum, West Africa Forum, Europe Forum. You know what this virtual forum, and say, please tell me in your society what is working. In every single society, what is working? Because clearly what we've been preaching and pushing brought us to this brink. So clearly we need to revisit. So what is it that you, in your response to this pandemic, what lessons have you learned so far? Tell me more. Tell me. Well, they might say, guess what? Girls' education. Thank God we have educated girls. And if it weren't for women leaders that we have now, we will be in a worse condition. I mean, in my country, Tunisia, 60% of judges are women. 75% of pharmacists and dentists are women. Why? Because we've invested in education of women and girls throughout. We had nothing else. That's the wealth. And that's why Tunisia is still relatively an exception after the Arab Spring. Look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at Libya. I can countless. Gee whiz, so women education is the threads and stitches that keep you together at times of adversity. Tell me more. So each nation is going to tell you what's working. And then we're going to say, gee whiz, it is criminal not to address the health sector system, because it's the health sector system that enabled Denmark and Singapore to deal with it. And we have privatized all the public. That's another awareness. One of the things that's going to change is the health sector is not privatized. It's not a commodity you can privatize anymore, that only the rich people can afford, like in this country where I'm living now. So that's one way. And say, by the way, we need to prepare the future leaders. And here is an alternative. So once you've created awareness, you open up people's mind to alternatives. So they are not, so you don't, when you talk about integrative learning or integrative education, you don't sound like a hippie with wilted flowers around your head, and they listen to you politely. And well, things have changed. You're going to listen to you, but you have to start where they are and challenge their mental framework and create dissonance, because they are desperate. The solutions they have are inadequate or made them even more vulnerable. So that is how, and technology can be the starting point. Have educators talk to each other. This guy who was creating a university for peace, this guy who is, so get educators to talk. What is our role? What is our role of educator? Because we as educators, we are co-creators. It used to be a very off left field word, co-creator. All of a sudden, we have to. So a forum of virtual forum of educators, virtual forums of medical people out of this unbelievable experience. I was reading a story about the Prime Minister of the UK, who was unbelievably overwhelmed by the love he felt around. He didn't say medical doctors and science, and the love that surrounded him. This is not someone who, so that's important. So crises have made us vulnerable to the bare minimum. And so use that as an opportunity without demystifying or minimizing the urgency of the response. But how can we, under the tyranny of the urgent, find enough force, enough bandwidth, enough space to focus on what is important, that it has revealed all of a sudden in our life? So the urgent does not hide the important. That through the urgent we uncover the important and say, okay, now that all these things are happening that are positive in our lives, whether it's solidarity, whatever, how can we revisit every sector? And education and leadership, these are two very transformative levers for institutionalizing change. But one way, it's not the only way, is to make people aware of what's already working, that already existed, but more importantly, that we have uncovered dealing with this crisis.
Thank you very much for sharing all these reflections and all these possible or potential avenues to rethink institutions. And what I've at least taken note of mentally is this opportunity of awareness to maybe question, and instead of just showing what's not working, just showing what's working, to maybe through leadership and entrepreneurialism scale what's working, and it might need and require less mental resources, and it might be less uncomfortable than just being wrong, but just following what's already maybe working. So thank you very much for this.
And it has a greater impact.
Definitely.
Because that's the impact. And what institutions come is upscale it, scale it up. And I've only talked about education as one of them. There are so many other ways. So institutions are very important, but you have to raise awareness, and then the institution would channel it and scale it up. All right?
Thank you very much for all your thoughts. Maybe Stephanie, do you want to add the last final note?
Yes, since we're coming here due to Home for Humanity, maybe we can come back to this notion of home. We once addressed it really quickly. Could you maybe share with us what is home for you, since you lived in several different places? Your origin is from Tunisia, as you just mentioned. And what is home for you? Or could you maybe even show us something that means home to you? Either way.
Home is a feeling, first of all. It's something that you carry. You can make a little shelter under a tree, a home. So home, unlike a house, is not a structure. Yeah. And many languages have different words for it. So home is where you feel yourself. Home where you feel at peace with others. And so it is the first basic human condition that is not given to everyone, unfortunately. You may have shelter to protect you from weather, but you may not feel home because of policies, because of structural inequalities. So home is something that is unique, and it is built over time. So my home is my country to start with. But if the policies of the leaders in my country make it tough for me to feel at home, then it's no longer at home. So you cannot divorce home from power and politics. But also, home can be a term to divide people, to give a sense of false security. For example, after 9/11, after the terrorist attack, we have home security. We have a Department of Home Security. Home is a place I go to protect me from the other. So it's not always a positive term. It's used to justify all kind of other policies so you can feel secure and safe. So, but I think the coronavirus, what it does is forcing us to revisit home. So the planet is our home. Yeah, it expanded. You can have your home that has a structure. You can have, frontiers and borders and all of that stuff, state-centric. But home all of a sudden expanded. Our understanding of home is expanded. from being at peace with yourself. Home is within you. If I'm not at peace with myself, then I'm going to look for home elsewhere. And it's an illusion. And that's why the center is very important. So you have to create it first. You have to nurture it. You have to look within. And so the coronavirus made us all go inside, forced us to look at the ugly and the bad and the good in us first. And so home is going to be more and more, how can we build a better home from inside out rather than outside in? Outside in means I'm going to get a security system. I'm going to raise my walls. I'm going to have a doorknob that take my picture so I can feel at home. You know, coronavirus made us look ridiculous and sound ridiculous when we do. So it's basically home is you, starting you. And any place then become home if once you are at peace with it. And then it expanded our notion of home, that the planet is our common home. Nature is rebelling, so we better make peace with it. So it becomes our common home. And people are going to say to to those who burn forests, those who explore gas differently, excuse me, you have no right to do that, because we are all become insecure. You are depriving the lung that gives us air by destroying it. So young people are going to be vociferous, young and old, going to be vociferous about what constitutes home. Because there is no planet B. And we cannot afford to have the planet angry, as you heard me say, on leave. So that's the notion of home.